Thank you for joining us today. In today's workshop, we will be learning about building and deploying applications to Azure using GitHub Actions. My name is Hassan Mohsin. I look after the reactor in Abu Dhabi. And in today's session, we will be learning all about GitHub Actions, which are powerful workflow automations that will support your project's success. And these automations in every step of the development and the delivery, you will be able to ensure that you are implementing continuous delivery in your applications during the session. You'll learn about GitHub Workflow, then control how the workflow is executed and deploy the applications to Microsoft Azure using GitHub Deploy action. And with us today, we are having Andrew Smith, who is a senior software engineering lead, and he's going to take us through the workshop today. Thank you so much, Andrew, for joining us today. Andrew? Do you hear me? Andrew? I'm going to pass the mic to you now to start the workshop. All right, just a quick reminder, we're all here to learn, so please keep a friendly environment for everyone and share your questions as much as you can in the chat window. We'll attend to these questions during the session. All right, Andrew, do I have you with me?
Okay, sorry about that. Can you?
Yeah, I can hear you. So I'm going to stop my screen sharing and you can start the workshop.
Great. Thank you for your patience with that. You know, Bluetooth is always a wonderful technology to fail at all of the times. Yes, thank you for the introduction. I'm really excited to be here today. Thank you all for joining. I'll go ahead and share my screen. So just wanted to give a quick shout out to all of the people joining from potentially all over the world. It's one of the things I love about these reactors is just how diverse a group of people can be drawn in, and it's just a wonderful to be part of a global community. Today we're going to talk about what is continuous delivery and GitHub Actions. We're going to walk through a lab that was created between Microsoft and GitHub to practice working with these concepts, and then we will wrap up. And as you know, as was mentioned, I'm a senior software engineering lead. I work for a company called Transparent Classroom, and I typically work with JavaScript and Ruby on Rails. All right, so that was just a little bit about me. Let's actually talk about the course. So I'm going to drop a link in the chat for everyone to view. Pull that up. Okay, so the link should be in the chat now. And if you go to that link, you will find a page like this, which is the starting lab for the course. So you are welcome to follow along, or you're welcome to kind of sit back and watch and then go through the lab later. The goal for me here is to provide some context about some of the steps along the way and like provide some extra editorializing so that you can understand how it all fits together. And as it's important to remember that you questions are always very much appreciated. So at any time, do feel free to drop a message in the chat and we will do our best to answer them. So when you start the lab, it provides some overview about how the whole system works. So I'll talk a little bit about that now. The basic idea is that continuous delivery is a term that was coined by Martin Fowler, or was popularized by him at least, and is the process of automating the build, test, and deployment of various environments. So you can have like a staging environment where QA can work on. You have your production environment where normal people will access your application. And back in the days of yore, that was all a manual process of packaging, bundling up your code, and putting it onto a production server. And continuous delivery was all about making that process automatic. So we're going to be working with a project that already has a running project, and it has presumably some continuous integration happening through GitHub Actions already. And continuous integration is like testing and making sure, building certain artifacts and all of that. What we're going to do is now build a CD workflow to build a container and send it off to a staging and production environments. So to be able to go through this lab, you'll need a bunch of logins like GitHub and Azure. So make sure that you have those prepared. So let's talk a little bit about GitHub Actions. I'm going to pop another link into the chat. Give me one moment here. Okay, so I dropped another link in the chat. And if you go to that link, oops, that was the wrong one, sorry. Let me fix that. This link provides you with a really nice overview of what GitHub Actions does. Basically, it's a way of running various commands in an environment to be able to build, test, and deploy your code. They've made it very easy to connect with GitHub. So if you've heard of services like Travis or even more enterprise services like Jenkins, GitHub Actions is like basically another offering into that world. GitHub Actions make it pretty easy to fire on any particular kind of trigger. So typically, your usual trigger would be a new commit being added to a branch, and then that you could say, okay, well, when I get a commit to any branch aside from my main branch, then I want to test them and then deploy to staging. And when I make a commit to main, then I want to do those things as well as deploy to production. So you can configure what kinds of actions you want to do based on what happened in your repository. The other really amazing and wonderful thing about GitHub Actions is that they make it really easy to connect also with aspects of your repository. So you can even do things that allow you to clean up your repository. So you could close certain issues, or you could clean up stale issues, or you could do any number of things. So the integration with GitHub is a lot smoother. They also provide an array of sort of pre-packaged configuration and actions that we'll see rather shortly. So that's like a sort of an overview of GitHub Actions. Any questions around what it does on a high level? I'll pause here to let people write into the chat if they have any questions. Okay. So the way that you work with GitHub Actions, as you'll see soon enough, is that you put them inside of a folder called Workflows. And then you can have various files that describe GitHub Action workflows. And in each particular file, you provide descriptions of things like when the trigger happens. So for instance, inside of your YAML, when you configure your GitHub action, you can say that you want this to fire when on a pull request. And in this particular case, what we'll be practicing is firing actions that when you place a label on the pull request. So in our case, we'll demonstrate when you add a stage label, then it'll deploy to the staging environment, or you could add a spin up environment to build the Azure resources. So the first portion is that you say, I'm looking for labeling of a pull request. And then you can provide more specific controls within that. So you can say if, and then a particular set of requirements, such as if the name of the label, so that's all of this right here, if the name of the label matches the particular word here. So that's kind of like a broad idea of like what the GitHub Action configuration is doing. Oftentimes we will need to access both Azure and Docker through GitHub Actions. And rather than storing all of those access tokens in plain text, which would be pretty terrible, you can store your credentials using GitHub Secrets, which is a really wonderful feature of GitHub. And that means that you can securely, in an encrypted way, store your secret, and GitHub Actions has access to it. So we'll practice going through that. Once you have a secret added to your environment, then you can refer to that inside of your configuration. And you can refer to it using this $, 2 curly brackets, and then eventually close them with another 2 curly brackets. And then you can say secrets dot, and then the name of the secret. So in this particular example, there's a secret here called Azure Credentials, and that is getting referred to down here in the code. As I mentioned, there are lots of different kinds of prepackaged GitHub Actions for you. So if I go to the marketplace and I look at actions, there's all sorts of actions available for you, which is pretty cool. So I'll go ahead and share that link as well in case you want to just kind of browse around later. And unsurprisingly, if you search for Azure Actions, there are a tremendous number of Azure-related GitHub Actions available to us, some of which we'll be using. So when we are building our action, we can give it the name of a job, and then you specify a certain number of steps. And each step here, so with YAML, you can mark an array by having dashes. So each of these are different elements in an array. You can provide multiple steps to a particular workflow. So in this particular example, we're logging in using this particular GitHub action, that like prepackaged GitHub action. And then we have another step where we log into Docker. And then we have another step where we deploy to a web app container. And then we have a final step where we run a command line. So each of these are using particular actions, like the Azure login one, that corresponds to a particular action that is hosted on GitHub that you can, learn about. So this is a GitHub action that you can bring into your project. So that's all of the parts about deploying or talking about GitHub Actions and the prepackaged things. One other thing that we'll be doing in this lab is that we'll practice creating and deleting Azure resources. So the idea would be that, since we automate things, we want to also automate the creation and destruction of our Azure resources. And so we'll be building a workflow that allows us to do that. We'll be paying attention to a label that has spin up environment or destroy environment to be able to signal whether we want to create or destroy resources. To do so, we'll end up using the Azure CLI to log in our GitHub Actions. So we pop into our action, we log in. We'll use, again, that secret that we'll set up. And then we just run a bunch of command line commands. So creating a resource group, creating an app service plan, creating the web app, and finally setting the container. So, there's a lot of text here. It's quite overwhelming. But the basic gist of it is these are just commands to provision resources for you. And they're all just, you could just imagine that GitHub Actions is, popping open a terminal and then saying, oh, okay, so I need to, I'm going to create a new group. And then it passes in all of the commands. So it's just like you doing it manually, except it's happening automatically through GitHub. So I'll increase the size of this in case we need to look at a terminal later. All right, so that's like the broad strokes of that. Any questions about GitHub Actions or the structure, the basic structure of these files? I'm curious, is there specifically, has anyone not worked with a YAML file before? Is that a new format for anybody? Okay, well, I will take your silence as understanding how YAML files work. So the biggest chunk is that we'll actually work on the Learning Lab. We might not get through all of it, but hopefully we'll get through most of it. So we'll just follow the link, and then this kicks us over to a GitHub Learning Lab to practice continuous delivery with Azure. It's a pretty cool system. The Learning Lab has a lot of really great labs in them. They're interactive. You're working inside of GitHub and doing individual steps, and then it gives you feedback. It's pretty cool. I'm very big fan of it. So to get started, we'll just start the course. There's some details about what we're doing here, but we can kind of gloss over that for now. So we will start the course. We'll say I want to create public repository, and that'll get it set up for us. So then from here, they give you a list of all of the different steps that you'll be going through. So we can start on configuring a trigger. So as I mentioned, the goal here will eventually be able to have 3 different labels that signify actions: spin up environment, stage, and destroy environment. These days, a lot of engineers, they'll use a thing that we call chat ops, which is, a Teams or Slack integration where you can talk to a robot and you can say, hey, I want to spin up this thing inside of your little chat window, and it'll just do it for you. But chat ops is just a different kind of trigger. We're going to be doing a trigger with labels because that's a little bit simpler. So here we're going to actually configure the trigger. So I'm going to look at the branch that was created for me. And I'm going to go into the file that needs changing. So we can see here I've got a new file that will signify the staging, the deploy staging kind GitHub action. And we're going to make some edits to it. The first thing is that we need to change the directory. So when we're working with GitHub Actions, we store all of those files inside of what's called a workflows directory. And as a fun little trick, if you want to change the directory name inside of GitHub UI, you can just go to the beginning of your file and then I'll just cut this out to make it more clear. If you to backspace at the directory level, it'll allow you to modify the directory name. So I'm going to change this to say workflows, and then I press the slash, and then it turns it into a folder for me. And then I can stick the file name back in. So pretty cool trick. I'm always delighted by what GitHub has to offer. So got a little bit of code to copy in. And as you know, we talked about what this code was saying, just that on a pull request, we're paying attention to when it gets labeled. So go ahead and make that commit. And then once that's done, we should see a new update from the robot to talk about the different conditionals. So this was the next piece that we were talking about how you can specify more controls. So let's break down the conditional a little bit more now that we're here. The if statement allows you to say, here's a conditional that contains is a function that allows us to provide a couple different parameters. In this particular function, we provide the value that we're going to be reading, and then the expected set of values that we can match against. GitHub Actions gives us access to a lot of variables, including things like GitHub event pull request labels. So this looks at specifically the set of labels that are on the GitHub object. And there's a link here to understand how the GitHub object gives you access to a bunch of information, and in particular the pull request event on that object. So once we're looking at the labels for the pull request of this event, you can use a star dot and then something to create an object filter, and it pulls out only the information that you care about, in our case the name of the label. But because labels have other things too, like their color or their description. So we do that star.name to basically extract the name from the set of information. So we're now going to add a conditional here. And we're going to add a little bit of more details about the Docker env, which we can kind of gloss over. But the basic idea is we're going to bundle things on Docker, and so we need to provide some information about that. So I'll just copy that in there. And while I'm here, I just want to point out another neat feature of GitHub. While you're editing a GitHub action file, it will also showcase other actions that you can pull from, which is pretty handy. Now that I've made my changes, we'll go back over here, and the bot has told us something new. All right, so this is where things start to get a little bit meatier. Here we're going to set up ultimately, we're going to help set up deploying to Azure. So at the end of the day, we're going to have a ability to deploy to Azure, and that means we need to log into Azure. In order to log into Azure, we need some credentials. To be able to get those credentials, we have to do a few steps. So that's what we're doing next. The first thing that you'll need to make sure of is that you have an Azure account and that you have the Azure CLI. I've already done that. There's links to be able to install them. It's pretty simple. But once you've done that, then you can go to your terminal and say AZ login. I've already done that as well, so I'm not going to go through that again. When you do, oh, I guess I do need to do that. I'm going to do AZ login. And that's going to take me to a login page. I'm going to log into my account. And it looks like I've logged in, and then it'll pop me back over to the CLI. So if I open up that, we can see now I've received some login credentials. The ID is the field that I particularly care about. This is the subscription ID. This was one of the other pieces that you need to make sure that you have configured when you go set up your Azure account. I missed this part, sorry. You need to add a new subscription. So a subscription is essentially a way of telling Azure how to pay them. So when you go to your Azure account, you can go to Home, and I have a subscription here that is a pay-as-you-go subscription. This lab won't end up billing you because you end up using only the free tier. Okay, so this ID corresponds to the subscription. You're then going to use that subscription to create some login credentials. So there's a particular command here that I'll demonstrate retyping. So you use that Azure CLI. You give it a name like GitHub Actions. You specify the contributor role. And then in Mac, you can use the // to be able to create a carriage return so that you can like space things nicely. That will not work on Windows, so don't do that. Just put it all in one line and drop the /. You need to specify the scope, and this is where that subscription ID comes into play. So I'm going to take that value here. I'm going to paste it down here. And then there's a couple more bits and bobs. Okay. So what this gives us is some credentials that we can work with. We'll use these credentials to now create some secrets inside of our repository. So if we go to our repository, you can go to Settings, Secrets, and then from here you can add some new secrets. So the first secret we're going to add is the subscription ID. That was the shorter one that we put in. So that was this number here. And then the second one is a Azure credentials. Now these names aren't special. They're just like descriptive of what they signify, but you could have named them anything. And that was the big blob from the terminal. So I'll add that secret. Once we have those secrets, we can then use them in our action. Now we're going to be pasting in a bunch of new things that's primarily around managing the image and talking to GitHub packages. But we can see down here, when we log into Azure CLI, we're going to use that Azure credentials secret there. The other secret worth naming is this GitHub token, which is a magic secret provided for you by GitHub that gives you, that usually just kind of works. It allows you to give access to GitHub without having to create a personal access token. All right, so we've got our secrets. We've got a few new steps to add to our workflow. So I will now go to the file. Looks like I lost the file. Let me pull it up again. And I'll paste all of that in. Okay, so I'll pause here for questions. We've covered a bunch of pieces. We've got our secrets. We've got GitHub Actions, logging into Azure. What questions are there so far? There's also like a lot of terms here, a lot of like kind of jumble of text. So, you know, if there's a particular keyword or the structure of the file, like this is a really great place to say like, I don't quite understand what this is doing. Can you break it down for me? Because, you know, that's why we're here, to fill in the little extra knowledge gaps that won't be able to be covered in the lab, the self-guided lab. So any questions around that? Great, so I got a question from ST. The question was, for workflows, can we use a service account or something similar rather than using individual account credentials? Yes, presumably you could. In this particular lab, we go through connecting it to a particular subscription, but I would imagine you can use a service account as well. Thanks for that question. And I would imagine, ST, that the way that you would end up getting there is a very similar process to what you did here. And you'd probably want to dig into the AD, this command, to find a way to provide a scope that leverages the service account. Okay, great. Thanks for the questions. Let's move on. So we've updated our file. I should probably see a new message from the bot at this point. Great. Yay, we did it. So now at this point, I can just go ahead and merge the pull request and delete the branch. And then sometimes it's a little delayed in responding, so I'm going to go ahead and refresh. There we go. And then we will be redirected to the next pull request. So we've got our staging file set up. Now we're going to work on the Azure configuration setup. The resources that we're going to work with are a web app, a resource group, and an app service plan. So the web app is actually the actual application that's going to be deployed on Azure. A resource group is a collection of resources, such as the web app that we're going to be building, and other virtual machines and databases and anything else you need. And then an app service plan is what runs our web app and manages the billing. So in our particular case, the app should run for free. So we're now going to work on a spin up destroy action file, which will be oriented around the creation and destruction of Azure resources. So I'm going to go to that branch, go to the file that needs to be changed. And I'll do that same little trick, or I'll go ahead and edit the file first. Do that same trick of changing the directory to workflows so that GitHub knows I'm wanting to work with a GitHub action. And then most of this is already in place. But I'll go ahead and copy the contents here, just to be sure. Okay, so now that we've got our file, let's talk about it a little bit. Once again, we see that we're paying attention to on the pull request when it gets labeled. In this particular case, we want to run this job if the label has spin up environment. And then there's another one down here. So there's two jobs. One is set up Azure resources. One is destroy Azure resources. This one runs when the pull request label is spin up environment. This one runs when the pull request label is destroy environment. So this is how you can kind of create multiple paths, multiple options. When we're spinning up an environment, we grab a repository. We log into Azure using those credentials that we mentioned before. And here are a bunch of here's all of those commands, those Azure commands of like popping into a terminal essentially and creating those resources. And then on the destroy environment side, very similar. We check out the repository, log in using those credentials, and then run some commands from a terminal. Okay, so I've made some edits. Go ahead and just commit the changes. And by the way, I'm not adding commit messages. That's probably bad practice. It's definitely bad practice. But for the purpose of this, lab and demo, I'm not worrying about having a decent Git history. But do as I say, not as I do. All right. So with that, we should get an update. Ta-da! So to recap, we now have two workflows, setting up and destroying. And there's a few global environment variables that we'll have access to, such as Azure Resource Group, Azure App Plan, and Azure Web App Name. Those correspond to ones that appear up here. So your env key is a great place to put keys that you want to reuse multiple times. So for instance, the Azure location, you need to specify which, availability, like which zone you're in. In this particular case, Central US. And rather than writing that multiple times, you can just stick it in an env variable, and then you can use it repeatedly. You can just invoke env.azure location. It's probably in other places too. Maybe not. We can see the web app name getting used multiple times right there. So we can see that the web app name here. You can see the web app name here. So it's a great place to create the variables that you want to reuse. There's a little bit of a breakdown of what are the different commands involved. So AZ group create, AZ app service plan create, and AZ web app create. And then it talks a little bit about GitHub packages, which is a place to publish packages. So Azure can work with lots of different container registries. They have their Azure Container Registry. There's Docker Hub, or there's a private custom registry that, and in this particular case, we're telling GitHub packages to be used as a custom registry. Okay, any questions about any of those commands? Okay. So at this point, we're ready to go. Oh, right. We're not quite ready to go. So now we're going to practice using the GitHub action. So I'm going to apply the spin up environment label to the pull request. So I can go up to the top. There's a section called labels. Click on that, and I can filter for them. I can say spin, and that will find the spin up environment that I care about. So I click that. I click outside of the menu to apply. And then if I scroll down, you can see I've added the environment, and then suddenly GitHub Actions kicks in. Now we can see there's a lot of actions. So let's talk about that a little bit. Several of them are related to the stage the app file that we created in the previous step. Those are skipped because I don't have the stage label applied. There's also the two configure Azure environment actions or jobs. There's the setup Azure resources and destroy Azure resources. The destroy one is skipped because I'm not saying destroy environment. And so only the setup Azure resources is used because of the label that got applied. So the more actions that you have, the more you will see them all listed here, and depending on context, some of them will be skipped. If I want to, I can go into the details for the action. And again, over here on the left, we can see the different kinds of actions available. In our particular configure Azure environment, we have just this one job that runs, and we can see all of the different steps. So these steps correspond to the steps in the file. If I can find it again, which I can't. So I'll pull it up. So I'll just put those two side by side. So we can see here, like, here's that first step, checkout repository. There's the Azure login. There's the create resource group. So you're providing a name to be descriptive about what it's doing. So all of these are connected. In a particular step, you can click on it and load the logs for that particular command. Additionally, if you click on the little drop-down arrow here, you can see any additional credentials. Oops, sorry, Luke, cycling through too many windows. Any other credentials, environment variables, things like that that are present, which is quite handy for debugging purposes. So for instance, we can see the response here from running our command. Okay. If for some reason you wanted to rerun the jobs, you can always go over here to the right and click rerun all jobs and then choose that option, and that will rerun them. Now, if I go to my Azure site, if I look for resource groups, we can see I've created a new resource group called CD with Actions. That comes from, darn it, did I just close the file again? I think I did. That's too bad. Let me open it up one more time. Maybe someday I will remember to not close it. So we can see that CD with Actions comes from that resource group being set here and being created from the terminal. So that's my CD with Actions that got created. That's the resource group. And then inside of there, I can see two resources. So the resource group is great because if you want to just kind of scuttle your project, you can just say delete resource group, and then you just blow away everything that was related to it. So we have two resources. We have our app service plan, which is the billing and scaling. And then we have our app service, which is the actual application itself. So now we have some resources. Okay, so with that, we can go ahead and approve this request, so then the process will continue. All right, it'll get merged. And then we can move on to the next pull request. All right, so I'll go ahead and pause here. Any other questions so far? All right. So let's see if we can get this working. The next thing is that now we have a staging and a setup environment. We have our environment already set up for us, so we don't need to worry about that. So now we're going to try out adding a stage label to see what that does. Start to filter for stage, choose that, and then once again, click out to apply those changes. Stage has been applied. Gives us some details, which I'll talk about. And so here we can see that stage the app is the one that will be triggered now, whereas the other ones are skipped. So I'm going to open up those at that action details. And we can see it's going through the build. And as before, you can always open and look into the particular output for a step. So the first part is the build. This is a Node application, so it's building with Webpack and then uploading an artifact. Then the next big step is to build the image on GitHub Packages. So now we're building the the Docker image. Okay, looks like that's all done. Lastly, we'll go to deploy the app container to Azure. Now, I'll be curious to see if this works. When I was doing this earlier, it was misbehaving and having an issue authenticating with Docker. So we'll see if this runs forever or if it will run really quickly. You know, this is always the game of live coding, is that the best way to discover bugs is to give a demo to somebody else. So I believe that this is one of the great secrets of software engineering. Don't waste any time like hunting around for bugs inside of code. Just give demos, and I'm sure you'll find them a lot faster. Okay, looks like the job ran, so that's good. We can get the URL for our web app in a couple different ways. When we do our deploy, it will print out the URL for us here. The other way to do it is that you can go to your Azure portal, go to your web app, and then it displays the URL there as well. So I will go ahead and try that out. This is the moment of truth that probably won't work. Yeah. So there's currently a issue with Docker authentication. So there is one thing worth showing as a learning from this, which is to, so that error, I reopen it. It said, look at your, application logs, diagnostic resources. So then the question is, how do I look at my logs? That's a very common need. If you're working with a web app, the first thing you need to do is on your Azure site. You go down to App Service Logs. And you want to turn application logging on. So you click on the file system. Normally it's going to start off with it being off. So you click the file system, you give it a retention period, and you save your changes. Once you do that, then you can start seeing logs streaming in. In this particular case, we can, for example, take a look at my container logs. So you can go to Settings, Container Settings. And you can see here are some logs associated with the Docker. And here we have our error. So there's the error that we were bumping into with auth credentials. So still investigating that, and hopefully we will get some clarity around what's going on. But that's a really important thing to be able to do, is to pull up logs, and it's a little tricky because you need to turn on saving logs first, and then once you've saved, once you've configured it to store the logs, then you can actually read the logs. And until you do that, you won't get any, which is a little bit confusing. So moving on. Although we can't see it running in production, we can still keep doing other things. So go ahead and approve the changes. And then that will merge it for me. Or maybe I have to merge it. Delete the branch. Okay. The last one is to look at the production deployment workflow. This one is very similar to staging. The only difference is that now we would be configuring it to deploy to production when we push on the main branch. So here's an example of a different way of a different kind of trigger. So previously we had the on push labels or types labeled, I think it was. I'll just pull up one of the files to compare and contrast the two. So in previous ones, we say on pull request types labeled. In this one, we're saying on push branch main. So we're saying when we get a push event on the main branch only, we'll do this particular action. And then aside from that, it's all basically the same. You end up building a file very similar that looks very similar to the deploy staging, except there's some words that say prod, but that's basically it. And because we're just about out of time, I want to briefly demonstrate the destruction. So if I wanted to, on a particular pull request, destroy my environment, I can go to labels, I can say destroy environment. That'll apply that label. And if I go down here, we can see, once again, actions have been kicked off. This particular time, destroy Azure resources is the one. I can open up details for that. And this will go into log into Azure and then delete my resource group. This usually takes a while, it's like a minute or two. But once that finishes, then the resource group that I have over here will go away, and as well as all of the resources that I had created. So that about wraps things up. Once you finish with the lab, once you finish all of the steps, be sure to go back over to the original Microsoft lab, because there's a knowledge check for you to do with a couple of quiz questions in there. And once you do that, you can get some experience points and level up in your learning of Microsoft systems. Okay. So I think that's everything there. Yeah. And let's hop back over to the slides now. So there's a bunch of different ways to join the community, which I'm sure will be mentioned later. There is an event code and a link for that. I'll go ahead and paste that into the chat as well. We do really value your feedback. It's the way that we learn and grow. So we're here to help you learn and grow, and you help us by providing feedback on these events. So please do take some time to go through, fill out that survey. And that's all for me. Back over to you.
Thank you, Andrew.
If you're speaking, your microphone, I think, may have dropped off.
Again. Is it better now?
Oh, it's crystal clear. Perfect.
Okay. All right. So yeah, I was thanking you, Andrew, for pointing that, and also for today's workshop. Please, for everyone in the community watching this, spend a minute to send us feedback on the Reactor survey and use the event code, and connect us with us on the different social channels, and subscribe to our newsletter, which is a monthly curated newsletter highlighting all the interesting things happening across the reactors. Now that we're doing our programming online, you are not limited only one reactor, which is close to you. But you can be part of different reactor communities and check out their programming as well. So yeah, thank you everyone. This session is recorded and it will be available very soon on our YouTube channel. We hope to see you in the coming ones. We have one more with Andrew next week, right? We hope to see you then.
Yep, see you then.
All right, goodbye, everyone.